Hey everybody, Paul here. So now we're going to get into really the meat of defining your theory of change, which is, as we talked about, really the foundation of your impact measurement strategy. So for the next couple of videos, I'm going to be really talking concepts. We'll talk through the key concepts, the components that go into your theory of change, and then I'll be sharing a few examples and some of the other considerations as you're defining this thing. So we're going to start by talking about identifying your target population, your problem statement, and your long term outcomes. We'll talk about why you start there here in just a second, but why is any of this important? So, really identifying your target population and problem statement first means that you really understand a specific who. If you know who you are trying to impact change for in your theory of change, this is going to really help you right along the way. It's going to help you define specific, concrete, meaningful outcomes. And really understanding the nature of the problem is helpful because if you understand the history of your problem, some of the drivers, some of the causes of it, then you can design solutions and think about solutions that are responsive to those historic causes. So now let's get into how this fits in to the full picture of your theory of change. As a reminder, your theory of change fills in really the missing middle between what your initiative does and the long-term meaningful changes for beneficiaries. So here are all the components, and we're going to be talking about service population and problem statement today, as well as long-term outcomes. In future videos, we'll talk about short-term outcomes, outputs, activities, inputs, and underlying assumptions. So these are the topics that your theory of change needs to touch on. And as we talked about in the prior video, there's a whole lot of different ways to format your theory of change. Really, we'll be talking concepts again here today, regardless of the format you want to hit these points. So in terms of the different formats, you might be thinking, oh gosh, this seems very similar to a logic model. How is a theory of change different from a logic model? So essentially, a logic model is one format for a theory of change. There are other formats for expressing a theory of change. And I've often seen a logic model be a little bit more detailed and written at the level of a particular program, as opposed to being written at the level of an organization. If you don't have some kind of organization wide description of your program theory, you should start there. Most small, medium sized nonprofits will be thinking program by program, and it's really easy for things to get incoherent. So I highly recommend defining your theory of change at the organization. So a theory of change can be more conceptual. It includes an analysis of the problem that you're trying to solve in your community. It also provides some space for talking about outside factors beyond just what your team does. And you want to, in your theory of change, talk about why you think this change is going to. So a logic model really describes the change in a pretty straightforward, linear, easy to understand way. A theory of change provides you some space for understanding why you think that's going to be the case, provides a little bit of more room for creativity in expression. So as we talked about in a prior video, you can have a conceptual diagram. There's a lot of different ways that you can express a theory of change beyond just a logic model, but a logic model is one very fair method of expressing your theory of change. Hopefully that helps clarify the difference, compare and contrast these two things. So I talked a little bit about sequencing. How do you approach writing this thing? Here's the approach I like. Generally, start by defining your target population or who, and also get clear on your understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve as an organization. Those two are pretty foundational because then your outcomes should be related to or the opposite of that problem. So then you get into thinking about longer term outcomes, then shorter term outcomes, then how your activities and the outputs, the concrete measures of the scale of those activities relate to your shorter term outcomes. Finally, your inputs and assumptions. And this ordering is intentional because it really sort of is trying to begin with the end in mind. We want to think about what is the long-term change that we're trying to affect, for whom and why. Is that change important? That's where this problem statement comes into place. If you start there and then you back up to your shorter term outcomes, back up to your activities outputs, then it really helps you make sure that everything is aligned to those longer term changes you're hoping to achieve. So I hope that that makes sense. This is my preference. You can take a different approach if you want to, but after having done many of these with, probably 20, 30 different organizations, I find that this sequence really helps. So let's talk some concepts. So target population, what do we mean? This is who you work with. And I've seen different language for this, and it's totally fine to also use language like this is our audience, these are our beneficiaries, this is our service population. I've seen different organizations gravitate to or dislike some of these terms. So it's really up to you what language you want to use, but ultimately you want to be very clear in describing who you work with that you're trying to make an impact for. So these can be individuals, they can be organizations, it can be a community. Regardless of that, you want to define the following. So first, demographics. We know what demographics are. These are sort of your unchanging characteristics, things like age, ethnicity, income, etc. Then psychographics. So you want to describe common attitudes or preferences. So psychographics are less known, but folks who do marketing or market research will think about these things. An example of a common attitude or preference might be, let's say we're working with youth who are involved in the criminal justice system. Often they have a pretty understandable questioning of or distrust of institutions because of their experience. So you want to think, are there common psychographics for the individuals that we serve? A final piece is indicators of need, interest, or risk. Some organizations will serve a population that is very high need. Some organizations are best set up to serve a population that has somewhat less need. And the structure of those organizations tends to differ. So it really depends on the nature of your mission, but definitely think, are there any indicators of need, interest, or risk that exemplify who we're best positioned to work? Finally, I think it's helpful to consider, okay, who's not in our target audience as a way of being really clear about these things. So target population, target audience, that's the first major concept. Start there. Go then to the next major concept, which is understanding the problem. So what you're trying to solve as an organization. I've seen this described as a problem statement, as an opportunity statement, as a context or situation analysis. Again, you can choose what you call this, but ultimately you want to analyze the following things. So first of all, how big is this problem? What is the history of it? How did this problem come to be in your particular area or geography? You want to understand how this problem is currently changing. What are some of the causes of this problem? And here, it's very helpful often to think, how has discrimination really played into this? Often, at least in the United States, racism has had an influence on almost every social problem that we're facing. So you want to be clear, how has racism, sexism, ageism, other forms of discrimination contributed to the problem that your organization is trying to address? Then you can think, okay, we've talked about causes. Now, what are the downstream consequences of that problem? If we don't address it, what does our world stand to lose, for example? This really helps you drive home the importance of this issue. And finally, think about some of the strengths that your target population has that relate to this problem. Here's an opportunity for you to integrate some research, integrate some existing data. And, I've always been surprised. A lot of organizations think we're all on the same page about the nature of a problem. Once you get different team members articulating these things, you realize that you're not. But having a really solid problem statement that everybody's on the same page about helps you really educate folks about why is your issue important and helps you get people on board to your cause. So this part of your theory of change is foundational and can be super helpful from a perspective of engaging other folks in your mission. One common challenge when you're framing your problem is stating your problem at the right level. What you're striving for here is to state a problem that your organization realistically can move the needle on. And so you want to make sure that you're not stating a problem that is so large, there's no way an organization like yours could make any difference. And you don't want to frame a problem so specifically that it's not motivating, that it's not inspiring to you or to other people. So a couple of solutions. So you can frame your problem more specifically, and this can be by geography or by a part of an issue. So for example, I was working with an organization. They said, hey, we're working to address food insecurity across the entire country. Our solution is that we've got a mobile app. And immediately some alarm bells started going off in my mind because it just seems like food insecurity is such a multifaceted issue that a mobile app is not going to really change the entirety of that thing. However, after talking with him, it really became clear they're addressing a part of food insecurity related to kind of the supply chain breakdowns related to food waste. And so if we start framing our problem in terms of really reducing food waste for a particular sector of the economy, like, for example, commercial kitchens, it actually does seem feasible that a mobile app can gain enough traction with that part of our food ecosystem to make a dent. So essentially, one solution, frame your problem more specifically. Another is be willing to flex your activities. So you might be a smallish organization. If you're trying to address a really large problem, there might be a different set of activities besides your current activities that you need to be thinking about. Like maybe you're thinking about doing some policy influence work or doing some advocacy, getting into politics. There might be ways for you to, even as a small team, touch on very large leverage points that you're not currently doing, but you have to be pretty flexible in how you see your organization evolving if you're tackling a problem that is much bigger than the current capacity of your organization to address. So just think about seeing this problem at the right level. That's all I'm saying. Here's some solutions for doing so. One last component that we'll talk about today, and that's outcomes. So outcomes are the directional change in knowledge, skills, attitudes, aspirations, behaviors, even conditions that you're hoping to influence among your target population. And as I talked about a few minutes ago, you want to start thinking about your long-term outcomes first, the most distant changes that you think that your organization really can influence in a person's life or in an organization's trajectory. So start by just brainstorming some of these, and they might be system changes, they might be cultural shifts, significant changes in status for an individual. Think about your long-term outcomes first, and just start thinking about it at this stage. In another video, we'll talk about breaking out some of your shorter-term and medium-term outcomes as well. So those are our three concepts: target population, problem statement, outcomes. I want to illustrate the first couple of these with an example. So this is a former client of mine, Objective Zero, great organization. They essentially have a mobile app that is designed to provide veterans with an opportunity to connect with other veterans and people in the military community. Their whole goal is to really encourage peer-to-peer connections among military community members with an ultimate intention of reducing veteran suicide and increasing veteran social connections. So here's how they described their target population and problem statement. And I'll let you read this if you want to, but it gives you a sense that this doesn't have to be extremely long. The problem statement is, I'm going to say about 4 sentences here. What I love about what they did was they used some data to describe the nature of their problem. So they say the Department of Veterans Affairs shows us that 20 veterans and service members die by suicide every single day. This is 1.5 times the rate of the civilian population. So they bring some data into this. They explore some of the contributors to the problem here, and they then sort of connect, okay, here's the part of the problem that we're seeking to address. Under target population, similarly, they've done a really nice job of summarizing it in just a few sentences and describing the scale of their target population. There are over 18 million veterans in the United States, 2.1 million active duty service members, 2.6 million family members, and saying, this describes our target population. So as you can use data, as you're describing this. So when you're drafting all of this stuff, I highly encourage you to write it all down at some phase. It's often common to have both a graphic version and a narrative version of your theory of change. So in the narrative, who are you writing for? Suggest that you think about who is an interested and engaged outsider. So for example, maybe we're writing for a potential board member, a potential funder, a key community partner who isn't yet familiar with your organization, somebody who will want to have a pretty close relationship and really see under the hood of your organization, but doesn't know that much about it yet. If you can think of one particular person, a real life person that you're writing for, that can be even more helpful because it allows you to really dial in how you describe things and avoid some of the jargon that is common when we're talking to folks who are already working with organizations. So I've got a few resources that I'll be sharing with you after this. So I've got a rubric, a grading your theory of change rubric. And I think that these things on the left are really the basics. So when you're creating your theory of change, you want to be aspirational. You want to be feasible. You want to go beyond your current status quo. You want to address all the things a good theory of change has in terms of the components. You want it to be coherent. easy to read, and avoiding jargon. So that's kind of the baseline. And then, here are some of the things that you can do to take your theory of change to the next level. So, for example, describing how our activities lead to meaningful results, lead to meaningful outcomes, providing an in-depth analysis of the problem, those sorts of things. And I can let you read this on your own. We'll link this rubric in the notes to this video. And I've also got a conversation guide, a meeting agenda, if you will. So if you have 90 minutes with your team to talk about this concept, I actually have an agenda that shows you exactly how you would use each of those 90 minutes and to really draw people's individual perspectives out, build some alignment, build some consensus so that then you can write down the best thinking of your group into your theory of change. So these are the things I'll be sharing. Again, here's the rubric. Really appreciate your time joining me in the beginning of this journey to draft your theory of change. And then the next video, we'll explore the next several concepts, the other components that your theory of change needs to have, how to get those things right, how to avoid some major roadblocks. Really appreciate it. Again, thank you.